Hello, everybody. It is Friday, the 13th of September, Friday the 13th. And appropriately enough, some of the news is rather scary. The news today is on the tech front. OpenAI, a private company without much of a business model, is raising new capital at a valuation of $150 billion. Meanwhile, their new version of OpenAI, their new intelligence, supposedly, according to OpenAI, at least can reason, whatever that means. And the FT reports today that OpenAI acknowledges that its new models could increase risk of misuse to create bioweapons. So massive valuation, AI reasoning, the creation of bioweapons, very chilling on this Friday the 13th. One man who has been following not just the story of OpenAI, but the broader story of AI is my guest today. He's an old friend. He's been on the show several times. Gary Marcus. He has a new book out. It's out next week, Taming Silicon Valley, How We Can Ensure That AI Works for Us. And Gary is joining us from Vancouver in British Columbia, where he says there are excellent mountains and even better sushi. Gary, happy Friday the 13th. Should some of this news today scare us?
I mean, I guess if you're frightened of a big waste of money, you could be. I mean, I don't know. I think actually people who are in the California pension fund might wonder what's going to happen with the investments they make through some of these companies. But we're not that close to AI that is truly frightening, like might take over the world. There are a lot of problems with AI right now that we should worry about, like the use of misinformation in the upcoming election. I think we should be pretty seriously concerned about. So it depends on, I guess, your definition of fear and what might frighten you. As to the valuation, I think it's ridiculous. We can get into it, but I think you already summarized it pretty well, which is that the valuation doesn't make sense for a company that has not only never made a profit, but has no clear business model for how it is going to make a profit. Part of the problem is the technology has been really oversold. So they made some money last year because they convinced everybody that they needed to have generative AI. And so, almost every business in the world actually tried it, but most of them found it's not that reliable. It hallucinates a lot, it makes mistakes and so forth. And the number of business cases for something that isn't reliable is not that high. A lot of businesses, if you use an AI that makes mistakes, you're going to get yourself in trouble. And then meanwhile, there's a second challenge, which is that Facebook is basically giving away, or Meta is basically giving away the same technology almost for free. And so you have a price war over something that doesn't work that well, that nobody has a killer application. And you have a company that had an operating loss of $5 billion last year, and suddenly their valuation is going to double. Like the math doesn't really make sense unless you think that there's some kind of mass hysteria. At least that's how I see it.
So I take your point, Gary. You're probably the most articulate AI skeptic. You've spoken to Congress. You and I have spoken about this endlessly. But then why come out with a new book if it's all a bit of a joke, of another Silicon Valley bubble where some people will make huge amounts of money and everyone else will lose their money when the bubble bursts? Why do we need to tame Silicon Valley when it comes to AI?
I mean, I don't really care that some people are going to lose money. It's not me. I'm not putting it in. That's not my problem. My problem is that even when AI is stupid, it can still be exploited. It can lead to power imbalances, and it can cause real harm in the environment. So I'll just talk about the latter first, and maybe by way of metaphor. Imagine that the dumbest possible person you could imagine were to become president. And let's further imagine that person.
We can't imagine that one, Gary, can we?
Well, I mean, some people will, be able to imagine that more or less easily than others. But imagine that someone that you think is stupid and delusional becomes president. The problem then becomes they have too much power. They could, for example, make decisions about nuclear weapons, and they might not be in full command of their senses. Well, that would be terrifying. In fact, Congressman Lieu, proposed a law last year that you shouldn't be allowed to use AI without humans in the loop to make nuclear weapons decisions. And you know what happened to that bill? It didn't make it through. So it is legal, in fact, to have ChatGPT or something like that, which hallucinates, makes weird errors of reasoning and so forth, run our nuclear weapons. That should frighten you. Forget about the money and who's going to make money, who's going to lose money. You have systems that are being given too much authority. They're also making misinformation. And the fact that they don't understand the difference between truth and nonsense, even in very obvious domains that are not controversial, makes them very exploitable by bad actors to make misinformation. So when I gave my TED talk, I gave an example of one of these systems saying in March 2018, Elon Musk died in a car crash. Well, in reality, he's still alive. Any rational system would see a lot of evidence for that and be able to correct its errors, to do sanity checking. But these systems can't. They just put together statistics of words. So somebody died in a Tesla in 2018, but it doesn't understand the difference between owning Tesla, the company, and owning a Tesla car. It's just working with the statistics of words, and it says a lot of nonsense. And so then you have the Russian government looking at tools that have now been given to them free by Meta, and they're like, well, we can influence the election that way, and they are. And that should be disturbing.
So, Gary, the book is called, as I said, it's Taming Silicon Valley, how we can ensure that AI works for us. Seems to be two things in Silicon Valley. There are very powerful figures. I mean, if we think of Silicon Valley as a metaphor, Elon Musk, of course, although he's moved out literally of Silicon Valley, and men like Sam Altman, who runs OpenAI. And then the technologies. You wrote an interesting piece recently for The Guardian, suggesting that OpenAI, Sam Altman, is becoming one of the most powerful people on earth. We should be very afraid. Are you suggesting in Taming Silicon Valley that what needs to be tamed is not so much OpenAI, but Sam Altman?
Well, I mean, if you were to leave the company, I don't know that the company would behave differently. The company was established as a nonprofit to help humanity. And my best guess is it's going to become the most invasive surveillance company of all time. I don't know if Altman left, whether that would still happen. I am concerned about Altman personally. You know, he stood next to me at the Senate, and I feel like he lied standing next to me after we both swore an oath to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. In that article, I detail some of the things. The most important one is probably that he said he was pro-regulation, but his company has been fighting regulation behind the scenes. It is in part, as you're suggesting, a function of who runs these companies. So, for example, I think that Larry Page and Sergey Brin really probably were genuine in saying that they don't wish to do evil. You know, that was the Google motto, "Don't do evil." And I think things have changed in Silicon Valley and extending maybe out to Washington State. Companies have seen the possibility of making a lot of money with generative AI. I think that they're actually misguiding in that belief, but they have become extremely aggressive. So think about Microsoft, for example. In 2016, they released something called Tay, which you might remember. It was a chat bot, and it quickly started spouting Nazi slogans and so forth.
Yeah, it was a big story at the time.
It was a huge story at the time, and Microsoft didn't like the optics and withdrew it after 12 hours. Maybe it was 24 hours. And then compare that to what happened a few years later once ChatGPT became popular, and they use a tool, they run their system on OpenAI's tools. They had something called Sydney. Kevin Roose had this crazy conversation with it where it said it was in love with him and told him to leave his wife and stuff like that. It's a sort of similar situation, but this time, instead of saying, hey, the optics here aren't very good and it's not very responsible and we're styling ourselves as a responsible AI company, they're like, we'll put some little band-aids on it and we'll just keep shipping it. And then, you know, a week or so later, Satya said that he wanted to make, the CEO, Satya Nadella, said that he wanted to make Google dance. And he really has. And the culture has really changed. The culture has changed to where people are rushing out software prematurely that has a lot of problems. And because the money is at least imagined to be so large, the companies just aren't behaving as responsibly.
Do you think of all these companies as being alike? You've noted you're certainly not the first or last person to accuse Sam Altman of lying. That was one of the reasons why I think he lost his job for a little bit of time, at least, as CEO of OpenAI last year. But are some of the companies different? You noted Microsoft. Our mutual friend Jaron Lanier did an event with him in Berkeley a few weeks ago. He works with Microsoft. He thinks that we should begin to trust larger companies like Microsoft. There are some people who believe that companies like Anthropic, for example, who are also in the AI business, are more responsible, accountable, more honest than OpenAI. Or is there some structural problem, Gary, with these big AI companies, whether it's Microsoft or Anthropic or OpenAI?
I might regret saying this, but I think being more honest than OpenAI is a low bar. They've done a number of things over the years that I've had considerable doubts about in terms of how they've hyped their work, how they are legally still a nonprofit with tax exempt status, but acting very much in a commercial company and so forth. That's a low bar. Anthropic is very curious. The CEO has said that he thinks that AI might kill us in a few years. I don't actually share that belief, but he has said that. And he at one point said, so we're not going to train, this has been reported to me, it wasn't public, we're not going to train so-called frontier models at the edge. And now they are training frontier models at the edge. And so I don't know how you can hold those beliefs at the same time and call yourself responsible. Like, if you really do think that these things place a clear and present danger, shouldn't you slow down on making them? Like, I just don't get that. Probably the most responsible player to me among the major players seems to be Demis Hassabis, who runs Google DeepMind and who I have some personal trust in. I've known him for a while. And I think that he really does care about AI risk and trying to get to a better place. So I think there's some range. It's not everybody in the industry is all exactly alike, but there's the old saying about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. A lot of money can easily corrupt, and I think that it has. And mind you, although the companies haven't made profits, the individuals who have stock in the companies do make money. So it's important to understand the dynamics of how this works. So if you have a startup company and you can sell your shares to somebody else, then you make money even if your company never makes any revenue. And so, almost everybody working for OpenAI, presumably in short order, will be multimillionaires. When Sam left, and then was rehired, they all stood behind him. But there was also an $86 billion financing pending at that time. And so you have to wonder how much was support for Sam and how much was because they wanted the funding to go through. And consistent with my sort of cynical view, after the funding went through, a lot of people left the company, like 10 or 12 very visible people left the company subsequently in just a few months.
Should we be then evaluating these people according to their own morality? You said you trust Demis Hassabis, his former partner, Mustafa Suleiman, now is at Microsoft. He did a startup with Reid Hoffman, who most people trust, very active now funder of Harris. Are there people in Silicon Valley who, more broadly, you trust more than others? Does it reflect their politics? I know politically, Gary, you're more on the progressive side.
I'm more on the left. I'm not sure I'm with the progressives these days, but that's a separate conversation.
Well, whatever the difference is, you're certainly not a conservative.
I'm certainly not a conservative. Well, that really is a conversation for another day. But I don't think it's as simple a fact as politics. It may be that Altman is actually on the left. I get
claims to be.
He is, and
that means.
Yeah, sometimes he seems to claim that, but then he's very close with Peter Thiel, according to many reports and so forth. I don't really know where his politics are. So in his case, it has nothing to do with his politics per se, but with how he has run the company and with his lack of candor, which is what the board said when they fired him. His lack of candor concerns me, and the actions concern me. So he's talked increasingly, for example, about training the systems on people's calendars and their email and so forth. And then OpenAI just bought a stake in a webcam company, and then he has the World what is it called? World.
Yeah, the thing that does your eyes.
The thing that does your eyes. I'm blanking on the name of the company. I came close to it, but anyway, so that's also a surveillance thing. And you'll notice that the company put Paul Nakasone, who used to be in the NSA, on the board. It seems to me like the only play for them left to make the money that they are now committed to making, if they're going to take this kind of funding, is in fact to become a surveillance company. And that concerns me. You know, and I should say there's another recent study that showed that LLMs can implant false beliefs in people and things like that. The systems can be very persuasive for naive people who don't understand how they work. And so, imagine someone has access to essentially all of your data and can build a chatbot that can influence you almost infinitely. What that leads me to think is we need checks and balances there. And it's not just that I think the companies are not always behaving well. And there's a whole section in the book about how I think they played Silicon Valley, but also, how Silicon Valley has played the public, but also how Silicon Valley plays the government. And there's a lot of issues about regulatory capture. I'll just give you one example that came from the Oprah show last night, which I didn't see but was reported. Everybody worries about what if the companies make all the rules? Well, Sam disclosed last night that he talks to someone in the government every few days, right? I think it's very disconcerting that the government doesn't have enough distance from someone whose own employees have said lacks candor. And to be that tight with him and not have enough independent scientists in the loop and so forth is a real risk for the US citizens, that the government itself is getting played. I know that sounds a little bit paranoid, but that's why I wrote the book, was to walk through all of the details of how that actually works.
And this isn't a new thing. I think Eric Schmidt, who at that point was the CEO of Google, I think he visited the White House more times than any other single figure outside the Obama family. So Silicon Valley has always been very good at schmoozing Washington, D.C. I want to get to the regulatory checks and how we tame Silicon Valley in a second, Gary. But I also want to make sense. I don't want to turn this just into a conversation about Sam Altman, but what motivates him? I mean, he has famously said, and I'm not sure if he's telling the truth here, that he doesn't own any stock in OpenAI. So let me just finish the question. Whether or not that's true, maybe he's using OpenAI to profit his other companies within his kind of business ecosystem. But there seems to be other things. For example, his obsession with acquiring the voice of Scarlett Johansson. What drives, do you think, people like Altman?
I mean, I think ultimately he likes making deals. I think that's the number one thing. That he's a complicated person. There's one, I guess, half page in the book where I evaluate just a single thing that he said in the Senate and what were his motivations. And I thought there were at least 4 different motivations for why he supported me saying that we should have global regulation of AI. And some of it is because he doesn't want to be viewed as Oppenheimer enabling some horrible thing, and he wants to fight that. So some of it is legit, and some of it is, if you make this stuff sound really scary, then people are going to believe that it's powerful in a way that maybe it isn't, like technically powerful in a way that it isn't. So he's not a simple person. There's not like a one-liner on Altman. I think he likes making deals. He likes power. And he's got a good thing going, which is giving him a lot of power. I do want to comment on the equity part, because it is part of where I started to really lose faith in him. Senator Kennedy said, "So you make a lot of money, right?" And he deflected and he said, "Well, no, I don't have any equity in OpenAI. I just get health insurance." And the reality is he has indirect equity in OpenAI, because he has equity in Y Combinator, and Y Combinator has equity in OpenAI. And his share is probably worth like $100 million, maybe soon $200 million or something like that. So it really wasn't an honest answer. And I think it's characteristic that he will tell people what they want to hear. That the Senate loved hearing that about this altruistic guy who was just doing this for the love of it. It's not really a true story. And he let that story ride, and kind of, then he gave another interview where he said, "Well, I already have enough money." But meanwhile, he's constantly making deals. And he, as you say, some of them are indirectly profiting from association from OpenAI. So there is, even though I don't know all of his motivations, I can tell you one of them is money for sure.
Is there something, Gary, kind of ironic and maybe in an odd way encouraging about the fact that Sam Altman, as you've noted, he's a really complicated person. He has some very good sides, some very bad sides, some very gray areas. We're never quite sure what hat he's wearing. He's clearly incredibly smart and motivated and all the rest of it. And yet, that reflects, and you've noted that AI currently at least isn't particularly sophisticated. It is miles, years, maybe centuries away from replicating the complexity of a Sam Altman. When we think of a Sam Altman, borrowing from Nietzsche, this all too human character, and this technology that is striving very unsuccessfully, at least in your mind, to replicate human beings, does that in an odd way prove your point?
I mean, I guess I have multiple points, and
you're a complicated fellow too, Gary. So
we're all complicated people. I mean, I really have two separate kinds of points these days. One is about the technical limitations of this AI, which is really what my research has been about for 30 years. It just so happens that my PhD dissertation was on the limits of neural networks that are the ancestors of current systems. And that's allowed me to have some clarity about what they can do and what they can't. So that's one set of things I've been kind of banging on about. And, I predicted hallucinations in 2001, and I reminded people of them in 2020 and so forth. So there's that technical research side. There's another side of me that has become enormously concerned about public policy since I have seen these changes in these companies over the last few years. And there my point is we can't trust the companies, and unfortunately we can't really be confident that the government is going to do right by us either, because the companies are lobbying the government so effectively. So those are maybe the two complementary points that I'm trying to make right now.
In your one of the quotes at the beginning of the book is from Marietje Schaake, who is based at Stanford, a Dutch authority on technology. She has a new book out, The Tech Coup. She's actually coming on the show next week. Her subtitle of the book is How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. How confident are you in traditional 20th century regulatory government? You also begin the book with a quote from FDR, of course, who's the ultimate credible regulatory authority. Can we go back to the 20th century in terms of regulating these companies as FDR regulated some of the bigger capitalist corporations of the mid-20th century?
I mean, taking another line from the 20th century and another famous figure, democracy is the best of the alternatives that have been tried. Regulation is the best among alternatives that have been tried. It doesn't make it perfect. I think a great example where regulation has worked fantastically well is in the commercial airline business, where you can fly halfway around the world on a flying bus at 30,000 feet, and you'll be safer than if you were driving your own car. And that's because we have multiple layers of regulation that have been worked out over time, regulating how you design an aircraft, how you build it, how you maintain it, how you investigate it if it fails, and so forth. I think it's a spectacular victory for regulation. I think the FDA works pretty well, but it works too slowly. So that's an example, that's somewhere in between. And we can all think of regulations that are just annoying, like the ones that make you press a button every time you visit a website around a set of cookies. And, that could be done a lot better. So, regulation, and I'm sure there are even worse examples. So regulation is not a gimme. In fact, one of the problems is regulatory capture, the companies writing the rules. So the companies help write, I would assume, Section 230, which gives them, the social media, freedom from liability. So we can't assume that regulation is going to magically appear on a platter. In part, a large part of the book is trying to say, these are the things that I think would actually work. We can't just say, wave a magic wand and say, oh, regulation, now we're done. Like, we have to be very thoughtful about it. And we also have to have that regulation develop over time. One of the suggestions is that we should have an agency, as we do multiple agencies with respect to airlines and transport and drugs and so forth. We can't leave all of these decisions to a bunch of senators who don't know the difference between GPT-4 and GPT-4o or whatever, but might need to ultimately as new technology comes online. So we need to have a dynamic and fairly broad policy. We absolutely want to encourage innovation. We don't want to stifle innovation. But if we have no regulation at all, we're going to wind up more like we did with nuclear power, where things were not adequately regulated. They were disasters and people aren't doing it anymore. And that's actually the wrong choice. So nuclear power is actually very safe. but a large part of the world has been convinced that it wasn't because there were some very high-profile accidents done because safety measures weren't appropriately taken. But now the world is suffering permanently from those early disasters. And I don't want to see something similar happen with AI.
Can we in America, Gary, look to Europe and the EU in particular for a model for regulation? Vestager, of course, the Danish politician, has been very influential. But on the other hand, the European technological economy is in crisis, in the doldrums. Should America try to emulate Europe when it comes to taming Silicon Valley?
I think America should find its own way, but it would be better if we simply copied the EU AI Act than if we did nothing. And excuse me one second. The EU AI Act is an experiment. It will need revision, but I think it's thoughtful. It's a good start. And it could be that the world kind of falls in line because I think that America is actually giving up a chance to be leaders here and to make a better policy. Like the U.S. Senate has not put any comprehensive AI regulation in at all. And so other countries, if they're going to look for a model, have nothing to look for from the United States. And they do have something to look for from the EU, and they may follow some of the EU policies. I think by and large, the EU AI Act is very well intentioned. There are very important questions open. For example, transparency is something that I talk about a lot in the book. It's very important. Even just drilling down to one detail, there's a requirement in the EU AI Act that there be transparency around data sources. What is a particular model trained on? That's very important because how the model behaves is very much a function of what the data is trained on. So whether you have bias, for example, is going to depend on what data is trained on. And you want to be able to look at those data to see whether copyrights are being violated, etc. So the EU AI Act has something to address that, but it's still entirely unclear how much detail will be required. Will you really, for example, have to disclose all the copyrighted sources that you're training your models on and hopefully license them or not, just to take one example? So there are many open parameters still to be filled within the EU AI Act.
To what extent with AI are we seeing history repeat itself? In the book and in pieces you talk about, and you had a piece in Fortune in which you described the theft essentially of copyrighted data by LLMs as a Shakespearean tragedy. That happened before, of course, with Napster and the theft of much creative content during the Web 2.0 era. Is history in an odd way with AI threatening to repeat itself? We have the creation of these companies like OpenAI, which are just the next chapter of YouTube, which was built, of course, on stolen video content. Is this a big Silicon Valley scam in that sense?
Well, I look at it a slightly different way, but related to what you're saying. So YouTube actually licenses what it does, at least.
But it didn't in the early days, Gary.
Early days, they may not have, but they moved to a licensing model. And that's what I think we need to do. So the analogy, slightly different analogy I would give that still pertains to what you're asking is Apple had a certain relationship to Napster, which is Napster tried to steal everything and failed. I mean, the name survived in some form, but basically the company died as we know it. And the company's mission was to give away music for free, or at least part of it, but stealing it. And the courts decided you couldn't do that because it was a violation of copyright law. The courts made exactly the right decision. And so Apple stepped in and started streaming, and they paid the artists. Maybe they didn't pay them enough, but they paid them something. And so licensing replaced theft, which is exactly what should happen here. So the irony is it is possible that OpenAI might do so badly in litigation because, in my view, what they're doing is not fair use, that they get in serious trouble, they get wounded, people start shying away from them. And Apple steps in again and builds in models that are properly licensed. Like I could see Apple doing that. That would be the most literal repetition of history that I could imagine if it shook out that way.
What advice, Gary, would you give big content companies in the US in particular in dealing with this new revolution? New York Times is suing OpenAI. Others, including News Corp, who have always been very hostile to big tech, are doing deals with OpenAI. Should they be suing them or doing deals with them?
I mean, that's not really for me to decide. That's a tactical decision. I think that the New York Times has a strong lawsuit, and they might win. I think that a lot of smaller companies don't have um, the horses to go through a long legal battle, and so are making deals. I think that they're probably making more favorable to OpenAI deals than they would have to if they litigated, but they're complicated um, questions there. From my perspective, I should say, all I really want is that creators be compensated, ideally well and fairly, and so forth. And so, there are different paths to get there. As long as we move from this kind of sanctioning of widespread intellectual property theft to some reasonable compensation for creators, I'll be reasonably happy, whichever way that falls out.
Is there a bigger problem here? You mentioned Elon Musk earlier. There's an interesting piece in today's New York Times about getting inside, and I'm quoting the Times here, Elon Musk's mushrooming security apparatus. There was a piece earlier this week suggesting he was going to be the world's first trillionaire. He's very, very active as the owner of X on political struggles, beating up his enemies. Is there a broader problem that the 20th century state is just not going to be able to compete with men of the financial muscle of somebody like Musk or perhaps Altman?
Well, I mean, look, Musk was mixing it up with the Brazilian government a week or so ago.
Right, and they pushed they punched back. I don't know whether it's going to be effective.
Well, they punched back to the point where he actually blinked, which surprised me in a way. And he agreed to not carry X on Starlink in Brazil. But I mean, that story is not yet written, right? A part of it is written. And I think you're right that we're going to see more and more of it. Musk is going to push things as hard as he possibly can. And he has the financial resources to do it. And governments have not mostly pushed back. And there was also the Telegram leader who was arrested in Paris. So, governments are getting a little tired of this. And we're going to see some epic battles, I think, between the corporate titans and the governments.
Are you sympathetic to that arrest of Durov in Paris? Do you think that the French government, I know you're not a lawyer, but in a broader sense, is this a healthy opening salvo in the war between nation states and big tech?
I don't really know the details well enough there. I certainly understand the inclination to do it. I don't know enough of the details about what Telegram has actually done to want to come down on that one. But I understand why we're going to see more and more of this, which is I think the governments do feel pushed around. I think they do feel that a lot of the tech leaders have been irresponsible. And so we're going to see more of that. And some of this, lawsuits are partly, politics, and people don't necessarily expect to win them or even criminal investigations and so forth. There's a lot of complex dynamics behind the scenes there that I don't want to weigh in on.
In the book, you quote Casey Newton, who's a very influential and very good, I think, tech journalist. Newton just came out with an interesting piece suggesting that Mark Zuckerberg has changed his mind. He calls it a 20-year mistake. He's done with apologizing. Have you seen a shift in the Silicon Valley zeitgeist? Are guys like Zuckerberg now, at least according to Newton and others, are they tired of apologizing and they're going to come out fighting? And maybe they're copying Musk.
I mean, my only direct source on Zuckerberg is I actually read that, or skimmed, I guess, Casey's piece yesterday. And, I'm sort of relying on Casey's reporting there. I don't know. But more broadly, I think that Silicon Valley has shifted to the right. I think that's very clear. Not everybody has, but a lot of it is shifted to the right. And I think it's shifted to a sense of entitlement rather than a sense of like, we're here to do the greater good. And, again, the clearest example is Google saying, don't do evil. That was a very, 2010 thing to say, 2005 thing to say. And now companies don't really care. They just want to make money, and they're not even trying that hard to have the optics. And then when we do, they're often not there. Karen Howe has a piece. I don't know if you have one of your slides today in the Atlantic, talking about all of the lip service that Microsoft is giving towards trying to sound like they're being responsible in terms of the energy consumption of AI, and then what they're doing behind the scenes. And there's a big dichotomy between the talk and what's actually going on. And I think that dichotomy has grown over the last several years.
Are you described yourself as a man on the left rather than a progressive, or certainly you're probably, by saying that, you're suggesting you're further to the left than a traditional liberal progressive. Are you
No,
concerned with
I'm not as far to the left as the. I mean,
anyway, you're certainly you're on the left, leaving aside the semantics of this. Are you concerned with the way in which Silicon Valley seems to be doing a job on Harris in terms of
I'm very concerned,
taxation
especially because I think a lot of it is dishonest. Like, there was a narrative for a month that which we all should now see was totally false, which was that Kamala Harris was dumb. And one of the leading people pushing that directly was Musk, and many people in his circle like David Sachs and so forth. And indirectly, Musk was pushing it because of the structure and dynamics of X. And I think X is now out of touch with the average American. Like, Musk is pushing a narrative that he is a centrist, but he had a poll and 78%, I think it was, said they were going to vote for Trump. And, the election is going to be close, but it's not going to be 78% Trump. Nobody knows how it's going to come out. But if Trump gets more than 52% of the vote, I'll be astounded. Maybe 53%, and he might get 47, but it's going to be in that range. We all know it's going to be within, for both candidates, within 3 or 4 points of 50. X is no longer representative of the world, and nor is some large piece of Silicon Valley is clearly shifted to the right. And it so happens that the same set of people is very anti-regulatory and so forth.
Well, Gary, as I said, you're somewhat of a skeptic on AI, but you acknowledge it's for real, and you know that in the next 20 or 30 years, it's going to become more and more real, more and more influential. The subtitle of your new book is How We, and it's we, I think is an important word, can ensure that AI works for us. Let's end by describing who we are and how AI can work for us.
Well, you'll note from the image you just showed that the book is coming out in paperback. It's under $20, and I militated strongly to do that, even though it means I would make less money, though I'm actually giving away the money. But anyway.
Now you're beginning to sound like Sam Altman.
I am going to give away the money, and I am not as rich as Sam Altman, but whatever. I'm fine. You don't have to worry about me. The point of the book is I want everybody to be involved. We, as all of us, it's mostly written towards American citizens, but it's written towards the citizens of the world. We all need to worry. As you said, AI is coming. I think it's coming a little bit slower than Silicon Valley would have you believe, but it's certainly going to affect every part of our lives, health, education, everything. And we need to get it right. I think GPT-4 was kind of a dress rehearsal that we got wrong. It was raced out, even though it was problematic. There was no kind of public consent or independent evaluation, etc. You could make an argument, in fact, sort of similar to the arguments people have made around fair trade coffee. When you drink coffee that is made by exploited workers, you're doing harm to the world. When you use a generative AI system, you're really doing harm to the world for multiple reasons. So these systems contribute to misinformation. They're contributing to a greater discrepancy between rich and poor. They're ripping off artists. They're using up lots of energy and so forth. We could, as a public, say, we will wait until you make better software. I forgot to mention covert racism and what they're doing in employment markets and so forth. We could say, we don't want to be part of this. We, the public, don't want to be part of this. When you make software that is not as biased and is more truthful and is fairly licensing the people on whose work it is built, then fine, we will use your software. But until, we won't. So, like, citizens could actually take action here. At the very least, they can think in the upcoming elections, who is actually looking out for us? Who wants AI to be something that helps a few very wealthy people? And who wants to think about the consequences of AI for citizens? And we should be voting in part accordingly. And we should at least be demanding answers. In the debate, AI came up only once. Harris
Right. I
mentioned.
was going to say that it doesn't seem as certainly neither of the candidates seem particularly
They're
interested in
not
it.
engaged. And like I keep thinking sometimes about Bill Gates wrote this book called The Road Ahead in 1994 and didn't even mention the internet. Like you can't make policy if you don't actually understand what's coming. What's coming is AI, and it will change everything. Even bad AI changes things. So bad AI that doesn't work reliably still, for example, causes problems of misinformation and non-consensual deep fake porn. I mean, the algorithms that make a nude of a 15-year-old aren't intelligent. They're just doing pattern matching, but they still cause harm. And so we're in this regime where AI is actually causing a lot of harm. The harms are going to get worse, and nobody's talking about it. That is why I wrote the book.
But is that really realistic, Gary? We've heard these arguments with every technology. We heard about Google, and everyone talked about, well, you should use DuckDuckGo. Very few people do. We've heard it endlessly about social media and none of the alternatives to Facebook. I mean, certainly the open source or networked non-profit versions of Facebook or other social media companies seem to have been successful. Do people realistically have the time or energy, ordinary people, to get involved in this? As you said, it didn't even come up in the debate.
I don't think that they think they do. Like, I know that I'm fighting an uphill battle, but there's two things. One is I would point to Jonathan Haidt has actually been very successful in getting people to think about the use of smartphones in schools. And I think he's single-handedly changed the conversation there. And I would love to be able to do the same for AI. And the other is, look, if we don't change, the costs are going to be really dramatic throughout society. So, I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm living in the movie Don't Look Up. Like, I don't want to give away the end for those who haven't seen it, but, Leo DiCaprio is saying that things are going to get really bad and people aren't necessarily listening. But, you got to try.
You bring up Haidt. He seems to want to ban social media, at least for kids. If you had one, and finally, Gary, if you had one free regulatory chip that you could use, what would you do with AI? If you could make the government do one thing to try and guarantee that AI will work for us, what would it be?
So in the book, I tell you why it can't be one, and I give 11. But if it was one, if I was,
well, give me a couple then. People are going to read the book. Of course, the one thing everyone can do is read your new book.
You can at least do that, and I will appreciate it. The number one would be something like the FDA for large-scale AI deployment. So people talked about a pause on AI. I don't think we need to pause research, but I think we should say, if you're going to deploy something to 100 million people or more, you should have to establish that the benefits outweigh the risks. And if you can't, you should have to wait until you can establish that you've mitigated the risk. So like for medicine, it might be all we need to do is to tell people to take this medicine with food, and then it won't rip up their stomach, and then problem solved. And sometimes it can be like you have to go back to the research lab and find something better. So we should have something like that with outside scientists having the right to evaluate and have some say over whether something is released. Because if this, GPT-4 didn't destroy the world, but it's causing problems, the next thing might cause much more serious problems. And right now that is up. This goes back to a whole bunch of your other questions. It's basically up to people like Altman and Zuckerberg. I want to release this or I don't. A lot of people left OpenAI because they felt like Altman wasn't listening to them internally, and externally the government has not had the spine to say anything. And now at least the companies are going to give pre-releases and so forth, but there is no authority for anybody to say this new technology that you've introduced is really seriously dangerous. Stop. And we need to have that. So if I had one chip, that's what I would do with the chip. If I had a second, it would be to have a national AI agency to oversee all of this, because there's so much going on. And right now you have people in existing agencies trying to cover things where the existing law doesn't really even anticipate the circumstances. And it's a patchwork and it's a mess. And we're missing out on the advantages as well as missing out on mitigating the alternatives. We don't have somebody whose full-time job it is to monitor all of this and who has the authority to move dynamically and quickly. I actually talked about this at the Senate. The senators were like, yeah, we're too slow. We need an agency. And they haven't actually moved on it because they're too slow. But having such an agency would be a really good thing. And we're going to lose some of our dominance to countries, maybe like China, for example, that understand that and really make AI front and center. China actually has better AI regulation than we do for the most part. There's some problems with it, but in general, they're actually more forward thinking about it than we are. That's actually going to help them. When we have nothing, we're eventually going to get hurt. We may have a backlash, like with nuclear power. Having an agency that would give us a smart, real-time response instead of a bunch of existing agencies kind of slugging it out over turf with laws that were written 50 years ago. An agency would be a great thing.
There you have it. Gary Marcus, always one step ahead, especially of slow politicians. His new book, Taming Silicon Valley, How We Can Ensure That AI Works for Us, suggests maybe we need to be one step ahead, not just of DC politicians, but big tech companies. Gary, congratulations on the new book. It's out next week. I'm sure it will be a bestseller. And we'll have to get you back on the show. This subject is certainly not going away. So, Gary Marcus, thank you so much. Always